The narrative of America's housing market has been dominated for the last year by the word correction. You hear it in the financial news, you read it in the mainstream reports. The market is cooling, the fever has broken, and the dark days of hyperinflationary price spikes are behind us. The media wants you to believe that the housing market has entered a period of gentle recalibration, a soft landing back to sanity, a world where the average family can finally breathe easy. But what they are not telling you, what they are desperately trying to bury beneath headlines of slowing home sales and stabilized mortgage rates, is that the crisis hasn't ended. It has simply mutated. The pressure has not been released, it has been rerouted, channeled directly into the most vulnerable part of the housing ecosystem, the rental market. For millions of Americans, the dream of home ownership remains a fantasy, locked behind the twin gates of high interest rates and the crippling inability to save a down payment. This reality has created a massive, captive audience of renters, and the corporate landlords and financial institutions that own your apartments know exactly who you are. This is not a market correction. This is a predatory cycle where the failure to buy translates directly into the exorbitant cost of rent. The housing shock you dodged by not buying is about to hit you tenfold on your next lease renewal. We are not talking about the modest, national average rent increase of a few percentage points. We are talking about the next rental shock, a localized, ferocious spike where rents will surge by 30% or more by Christmas in the hottest, most desperate markets. This spike will force massive migration, drain bank accounts, and crush the middle-class dream in America's fastest-growing cities. In this deep-dive investigation, Discover the Nation reveals the 10 U.S. cities where economic pressure, dwindling inventory, and corporate ownership have combined to create a perfect storm, guaranteeing a 30% rental increase before the holidays. If you are living in, moving to, or investing in any of these areas, this is your urgent 90-day warning. The time to plan is now, before the cold hammer of the rental shock falls and locks you into an untenable financial future. We will expose the data, uncover the true driving forces, and show you exactly where the crisis is accelerating fastest. Subscribe now, because what you don't know about these 10 cities could cost you everything. We begin our countdown at number 10, focusing on a metro that symbolizes the tragedy of the deferred American dream, San Jose, California. For decades, San Jose was the engine room of Silicon Valley, the place where technological innovation met high-income salaries. The myth was that while you paid a premium, you bought into prosperity. But the reality for the renter class has become a crushing squeeze. After a brief pandemic dip, the market is back with a vengeance. The data we are tracking shows a terrifying trend. The AI boom has reignited the fire of high-wage immigration, but the local housing supply remains structurally deficient. Local regulations have dramatically restricted the development of mid-market, multifamily housing, creating an extreme imbalance. Corporate tech leases are pouring money into the luxury apartment towers, creating artificial demand at the top end of the market. This financial pressure is then transferred down, raising the cost of every single housing unit beneath it. The renter who is not an executive or a senior engineer is left competing against billion-dollar company budgets. San Jose's rental vacancy. When vacancy is that tight, the negotiating power of the landlord is absolute rate, already one of the lowest in the nation, is projected to hit an emergency 1.5% by Thanksgiving. We project that any lease renewal coming due in the next 3 months will be an opening for a ruthless 30% rent hike, a spike designed to weed out the less affluent and preserve the city for the highest earners. The narrative of the tech hub promised wealth for all. The data on the ground shows a city ruthlessly filtering out the middle class and the support structures necessary to keep the tech ecosystem running. The dream of Silicon Valley has become a rental nightmare, and the coming spike is merely the latest, cruelest iteration of that betrayal. San Jose is not correcting, it is culling. Moving on to number 9, we shift our focus from the established tech core to the surging Sunbelt, landing on Pensacola, Florida. For years, Pensacola was the quiet alternative on the Gulf Coast, offering the famed Florida lifestyle, the beaches, the warm weather, the lack of state income tax, without the financial insanity of Miami or Tampa. It became a refuge for remote workers seeking affordability. That affordability is now a ghost of the past. The key data point here is not just in-migration, but uninsurability. The relentless escalation of climate-related risk and the withdrawal of major national insurance carriers from the Florida market has introduced a catastrophic new cost for every landlord. Those rising insurance premiums, which have doubled or even tripled for coastal properties, are not being absorbed by property owners. They are being immediately and entirely downloaded onto the tenant through inflated monthly rent. When a landlord's insurance cost jumps by $2,000 a year, their business model dictates that your rent must increase by more than that to maintain the profit margin. Combine this with the booming demand fueled by military expansion and the continued arrival of out-of-state money, and you have a market where a forced 30% spike is not a possibility, it's a financial necessity for the property owner. The beautiful coastal facade of Pensacola conceals a dangerous, rapidly collapsing economic foundation for renters. The price of sunshine is now being calculated not just in dollars, but in the ruthless elimination of middle-class tenants who cannot afford to subsidize the mounting climate risk. The stability that renters thought they found in Pensacola is dissolving into the rising tide of homeowner costs, making the city a clear and imminent candidate for the next rental shock. The warm embrace of the Sun Belt is about to become a very cold financial wake-up call for thousands of renters whose budgets were predicated on a cost of living that no longer exists. The system is designed to pass every ounce of risk onto the end user, and in Pensacola, that end user is the renter. Our trajectory takes us next to the heart of the Midwest, to the metro area at number 8, Grand Rapids, Michigan. The myth of the Midwest has always been its stability, its steady pace, and its inherent value. Grand Rapids was the symbol of this, a robust economy anchored by manufacturing, healthcare, and education, a place where you could build a life without the coastal price tag. But that myth has been aggressively dismantled by institutional investors. The key threat here is the erosion of the single-family rental, SFR, market by corporate entities. While the national media focuses on multifamily high-rises, Grand Rapids has seen a quiet, terrifying takeover of its smaller, more affordable single-family homes, the kind traditionally owned by a mom-and-pop landlord. These corporate buyers, armed with AI-driven pricing algorithms and all-cash offers, have converted owner-occupied homes into high-profit rental units. The result is a total destruction of local market competition. With nearly a quarter of all entry-level homes now owned by investment groups, the supply of available rental units is artificially suppressed, and the pricing strategy is no longer human, it is algorithmic. These sophisticated models use real-time data to find the absolute maximum rent the market will bear. Grand Rapids' vacancy rate, hovering stubbornly near a 2-decade low, allows these algorithms to function with brutal efficiency. The 30% spike here will feel like a targeted attack, a sudden, merciless jump from a computer that sees you only as a revenue stream. This is the financialization of community in action. The sense of stability that defined Grand Rapids is being replaced by the volatility of Wall Street investment vehicles, making the city a stark example of how corporate ownership can dismantle local affordability overnight. The once dependable rhythm of the Midwest is breaking down, and the cost of that breakdown will be paid by the thousands of renters trapped in a market now controlled by remote, profit-maximizing shareholders. This is not housing, it is an asset class for them, and the asset class demands a higher return. This demands a massive, immediate spike. The next city on our countdown, number 7, brings us to the urban core of the Northeast, Worcester, Massachusetts. For decades, Worcester existed as the blue-collar, backup city for Boston, a place where the commuter, priced out of the capital, could find relative relief. The myth was simple: proximity without premium. Today, that entire economic model has collapsed. Worcester is experiencing what experts call dual market overflow. The housing crises in both Boston and Providence have become so extreme that a massive wave of renters has been pushed westward into Worcester, flooding the city with demand that its local inventory simply cannot absorb. Unlike the Sun Belt, Worcester lacks the space and the regulatory environment for rapid multifamily construction. The key data point is the transit-adjacent vacancy rate. Apartments within a short drive or train ride of Boston are now seeing bidding wars among renters, a phenomenon previously reserved only for home sales. The market's affordability advantage has vanished, replaced by a ruthless new normal. The rental spike here is a pure function of geographic scarcity. The demand is not coming from local wage growth, which remains stagnant, it is coming from the wealth differential of Boston area salaries. When a Boston-employed renter can pay an extra $500 a month and still save money compared to living closer to the city, they effectively destroy the local market for the long-time Worcester resident. The 30% spike will not only be achievable for landlords, but will feel justified to the incoming, high-salary renter base. For the existing community, the new math means total displacement. Worcester is not suffering from a local problem. It is suffering from being the economic pressure release valve for two of the nation's most expensive cities. The promise of quiet affordability has been betrayed by its own excellent location, and the rent shock is the final invoice for that proximity. It is a terrifying example of how local communities become casualties in the wider, unchecked war against housing affordability in America. Our countdown of the 10 cities facing the next rental shock, a potential 30% spike by Christmas, continues with number 6, Boise, Idaho. The story of Boise is perhaps the most visible example of how external financial pressure can instantly overwhelm a local housing market. For years, Boise was the model of the hidden gem, a clean, safe, scenic capital city with a growing tech presence and an unbeatable quality of life, all wrapped up in a relatively low cost of living. It was the preferred destination for the great exodus from California and the Pacific Northwest. The myth was that this Mountain West refuge offered sustainable growth and balanced affordability. That myth has been utterly decimated. The betrayal here lies in the sheer velocity of migration combined with a fundamental lack of forward planning by city leadership. The influx of new residents during the pandemic was so intense that it created a population shockwave that the housing market has never recovered from. The key data point is the vacancy rate crisis. Boise's rental vacancy rate has spent the last few years hovering near historic lows, often dipping below 2%. When a market is that tight, every empty unit becomes a scarce, high-value commodity. Landlords and institutional investors, who flooded the market to capitalize on the incoming wealth, are now operating in an environment of total security. They know that every single person moving to Boise, whether they are a high-wage tech worker or a low-wage service worker, must find a place to live. And there are simply not enough doors. The 30% spike here will be aggressive and sudden because the demand is inelastic. People are already committed to the move. Furthermore, the local wage growth has not kept pace with the rental escalation, creating a massive divergence. This rental shock is effectively a tax on the
existing working class, forcing them into longer commutes, smaller units, or out of the metro area entirely. The Mountain West dream is rapidly turning into a financial nightmare, where the beauty and lifestyle are now only accessible to the highest bidders. Boise stands as a stark warning. The hidden gem status is a volatile asset, and when discovered by mass migration, the existing population is the first casualty. The city that promised a better life is now ruthlessly prioritizing newcomers with larger bank accounts, using the rental shock as the ultimate filtering mechanism. Shifting our focus south, we arrive at number 5, Knoxville, Tennessee. Knoxville represents the hidden danger in the Sun Belt's rapid, decentralized growth. While major metros like Nashville and Atlanta have received the media spotlight for their growth, Knoxville has been quietly and consistently soaking up the overflow. The myth was that this city offered a genuine Southern lifestyle, charming, affordable, and supported by a strong university presence. The betrayal, however, comes from its overlooked status. Because it wasn't the headline metro, developers and investors underestimated its explosive growth potential until it was too late to stabilize the market with new supply. The key data point is the ratio of available housing to job creation. Knoxville's job market, fueled by logistics, healthcare, and the energy sector, has grown at an astonishing rate. But the housing stock, dominated by older homes and slower-paced apartment development, has failed to keep up. This is a pure supply-demand imbalance amplified by the influx of retirees and remote workers who see the low state taxes as a massive incentive. When competition for limited rental units combines the budgets of high-saving retirees, remote coastal workers, and local professionals, the system breaks. Landlords are viewing the market with unfettered confidence, knowing they can demand extreme prices. The 30% spike in Knoxville will feel particularly cruel because it strikes at the core of the city's identity, affordability. The cost of living advantage that drew thousands is now being weaponized against them. This spike will create a severe labor crisis, as the very workers needed to support the booming economy, service workers, teachers, nurses, will be unable to afford to live within the city limits. Knoxville is a crucial example of a medium-sized market that became a victim of its own success, demonstrating that once the financial machine turns its attention to an affordable city, the resulting shock is often more violent than in the already expensive hubs. At number 4, we return to the Northeast, specifically Worcester, Massachusetts, which we briefly touched on earlier, to drill down into the specific, localized mechanisms driving the price spike. The reason Worcester ranks so high is the structural inability to adapt. The city is tightly constrained by its geography and its older housing stock. The myth of Worcester was the commuter's haven, a stable, reliable bedroom community. The betrayal is that its stability has become its weakness. The market is not just suffering from overflow, it is suffering from investment scarcity. Due to high regulatory hurdles, the cost of building new, mid-market apartment complexes is prohibitive for all but the largest developers. This means the existing rental inventory, often older, less efficient, and saddled with high maintenance costs, must shoulder 100% of the demand pressure from Boston and Providence. The key data point here is the tenant-to-listing ratio near major transit lines. This ratio is soaring far faster than in surrounding towns, indicating a desperate, concentrated competition for the most convenient units. Furthermore, the rising cost of utilities and maintenance in aging New England structures is adding another layer of expense that landlords must recover, often through aggressive rent hikes that exceed 20% just to cover overhead. For a landlord in a desirable Worcester location, the 30% spike by Christmas is not only feasible, but financially irresistible. They face a market where thousands of desperate, relatively high-earning commuters are scrambling for a few dozen units. This rental shock represents a silent, final annexation by the Boston and Providence economies, turning Worcester from a haven into a high-cost outpost. The city's identity as a refuge is being permanently erased by the economic gravity of its wealthier. Neighbors, leaving local residents trapped in a bidding war they cannot possibly win against coastal wages. This is a cruel economic inevitability. Our descent into the most threatened markets brings us to number 3, Charlotte, North Carolina. Charlotte has been the darling of the new American economy for years, a sprawling, modern financial and tech hub that promised endless opportunity and southern hospitality. The myth was the balanced boom, a city growing fast but thoughtfully, where supply could keep up with demand. The betrayal is that the thought was an illusion. The city's core problem is the hyper-concentration of corporate talent relocation combined with a sprawling suburban geography that actually increases competition in key rental zones. The key data point is the lease-up rate of new Class A apartments. While construction cranes dot the skyline, these new, luxury units are being absorbed at an alarming speed, often pre-leased by corporations moving large workforces. This doesn't relieve pressure on the existing mid-market housing, it simply establishes a new, higher ceiling for rent. Every time a $3,000 apartment is immediately leased, the landlord of the $1,800 apartment next door feels emboldened to raise their price to $2,300, knowing the corporate overflow will catch them. The 30% rental spike here is a result of financial stratification. The market is actively dividing the city into the haves, corporate transfers, and the have-nots, local workforce, using the rental renewal as the point of no return. Furthermore, the sprawl often necessitates owning multiple vehicles, and when you factor in the rising cost of gas, insurance, and maintenance, the true cost of renting in Charlotte is far higher than the sticker price suggests. This is a city that grew too fast, attracted too much corporate capital, and failed to protect its middle tier. The coming rental shock will be Charlotte's final, painful lesson that a balanced boom cannot be achieved without aggressive intervention to protect local supply. The financial hub is about to break the bank of its own citizens. The rental crisis here is a sophisticated, calculated extraction of wealth, demanding a quick and violent rent spike. Now, we shift to a metro that has been the subject of countless national headlines, yet remains a ticking rental time bomb. Number 2, Brooklyn, New York. The story of Brooklyn's real estate is a saga of transformation, from working-class neighborhoods to a global luxury brand. After the initial shock of the pandemic, many expected a long, sustained cooling period. The myth was that the remote work revolution would decentralize New York and render its extreme cost obsolete. The betrayal is that the magnetism of the city remains unbreakable. The key data point here is the extreme, persistent deficit in available units. Despite the return of remote work, Brooklyn has seen a massive return of young professionals, artists, and global citizens all competing for an irreplaceable inventory of historic brownstones and desirable transit-adjacent units. The pandemic merely paused the growth, it didn't kill it. Rental vacancy rates have once again plunged toward historic lows, making every open house a full-scale bidding war. The 30% spike here is fueled by a desperate, high-earning tenant base that is literally addicted to the city life. They are willing to pay almost anything to avoid a commute to New Jersey or a move to a less vibrant market. Landlords, particularly those who own smaller, multifamily brownstones, are recovering the massive costs of property taxes, utility retrofits, and aging infrastructure, all of which have soared due to inflation and new local regulations. That cost recovery is non-negotiable. Furthermore, new rent control regulations, meant to help tenants, have an insidious side effect. They disincentivize landlords from maintaining or improving older units, tightening the supply of quality housing even further. Brooklyn is now in a vicious cycle of inelastic demand meeting shrinking quality supply. The borough that promised culture and opportunity is now ruthlessly pricing out the very people who created that culture. The price of proximity to Manhattan, the price of the it factor, is being demanded upfront, and it will be brutal. The coming rental shock is a final, painful testament to the unbreakable, yet financially destructive, gravity of New York City. We have detailed the intense economic and demographic pressures building in 9 major U.S. rental markets. Now we must turn our attention to the market that stands poised at number 1, the epicenter of the next rental shock, Bozeman, Montana. The story of Bozeman is not one of a sudden crisis, but one of a slow-motion financial annexation. Bozeman was, for decades, the unspoiled heart of the Rocky Mountains, a university town nestled in the valley, a gateway to Yellowstone, and a place defined by its commitment to outdoor life and community values. The myth was that the mountain isolation would forever protect its rustic affordability. The betrayal is that this isolation made it a perfect, high-value target for a massive influx of wealth. Bozeman has become the preferred destination for ultra-high net worth individuals, tech executives, and celebrities seeking privacy and low-density living. This wealth migration has done something far more corrosive than simply raise home prices. It has fundamentally decoupled the rental market from the local economy. The key data point that defines the crisis in Bozeman is the wage-to-rent ratio. The median rent in Bozeman is often affordable only to someone earning 3 to 5 times the local median wage. This means that the entire rental market is dictated not by the budgets of the teachers, nurses, and service staff who keep the town running, but by the expense accounts of remote millionaires. Landlords, particularly those who own the small, desirable multifamily properties near the downtown core or the university, are under no pressure whatsoever to cap prices. They know that a high-salary newcomer will pay a 30% increase with barely a second thought. The spike here is not just an opportunity, it is an inevitability because the market is not functioning as a traditional housing market. It is functioning as a luxury holding tank for coastal wealth. The 30% rental shock in Bozeman will be the loudest alarm bell for the entire American West. It demonstrates that when a small community is targeted by a wave of concentrated wealth, the rental market is the first thing to shatter. The existing residents are left with a brutal choice: either accept crushing rent increases that necessitate 2 or 3 jobs, or exit the area entirely, forcing the local service economy to collapse under the weight of unaffordability. Furthermore, the limited geographical space for new construction, hemmed in by mountains and national forest land, guarantees that supply will never catch up to demand. The few new apartments that are built are exclusively high-end, luxury units that only raise the ceiling price even higher. Bozeman's rental crisis is a class war fought on the housing front, and the coming spike is the final surrender of the local economy to external financial interests. The mountain air may be free, but the cost of the roof over your head is being set by billionaires, guaranteeing a price shock unlike anything the region has ever seen. The story here is a painful lesson. Beauty and nature are no defense against the forces of unchecked wealth migration. Now that we have revealed the 10 cities facing the most severe and imminent rental spikes, we must step back and examine the 3 foundational, interconnected forces driving this next rental shock. This is not a random occurrence, it is a calculated, structural market failure that is being exploited for massive profit. The first force, inelastic demand and the homeownership trap. The primary engine of the rental shock is the frozen homeownership market. When mortgage rates shot past 6% and stayed there, roughly 40 million potential first-time homebuyers were instantly pushed out of the purchasing market. These individuals, many of whom have stable jobs and decent savings, are now forced to remain in the rental pool. This created a massive, captive audience of high-quality tenants for landlords. The demand for housing is almost perfectly inelastic, meaning people must rent, regardless of the price. This trapped demand gives landlords the ultimate leverage. The narrative of the cooling housing market is dangerous because it ignores the fact that every failed homebuyer immediately becomes a strong new renter, increasing competition and allowing corporate landlords to raise prices with impunity. The high cost of buying a home is directly funding the high cost of renting one. The two markets are locked in a vicious feedback loop, with the renter always losing. The failure of the homeownership dream has become the foundation of the rental crisis. This crisis is structural, pervasive, and shows no signs of reversing until interest rates fall substantially, a prospect that looks increasingly distant. The second force, the algorithmic landlord and corporate consolidation. This is the most sinister force driving the price spike, particularly prevalent in cities like Grand Rapids and Charlotte. Over the past decade, institutional money, pension funds, hedge funds, and private equity has aggressively consolidated the American rental market, particularly the single-family rental (SFR) sector. These companies do not operate on human negotiation or empathy, they operate on AI-driven pricing models. Algorithms, like RealPage's YieldStar, though they are not the only company using this model, are designed to analyze real-time market data, vacancy rates, competitor pricing, lease expiration dates, to find the absolute highest price a tenant will accept. They are incentivized to keep supply tight and prices high. When one major landlord in a metropolitan area uses such an algorithm, it forces every smaller competitor to follow suit, creating a market where prices are cooperatively maximized. This eliminates competition and guarantees that rental prices across the entire metro move in lockstep toward the maximum ceiling. For the renter facing a 30% increase, the enemy is not a single, greedy landlord, it is a sophisticated, centralized system designed to extract every possible dollar from your budget. The human element has been removed, replaced by a ruthless, profit-maximizing machine that views housing as a financial instrument, not a social necessity. This corporate consolidation has fundamentally broken the organic function of the local rental market. The third force, the insurance and infrastructure collapse. This force is most acute in cities like Pensacola and the older markets of the Northeast. The true cost of owning and maintaining property in America is soaring due to two non-negotiable factors: rising climate risk and failing infrastructure. Insurance carriers are either withdrawing entirely, as seen in parts of Florida and California, or dramatically raising premiums due to increased flood, fire, and storm risk. Simultaneously, the cost of replacing or maintaining aging infrastructure, piping, wiring, roofing in older cities like Worcester and Brooklyn has skyrocketed due to inflation and labor shortages. Landlords are facing massive, unavoidable increases in their overhead in some cases, doubling their fixed costs in a single year. These costs are not being absorbed by the property owner, they are being passed through, with extreme prejudice, directly to the tenant. The 30% spike in these markets is often a landlord's desperate attempt to maintain their profit margin while covering the non-negotiable rising costs of climate change and structural decay. The renter is now being forced to financially subsidize the nation's failure to address its climate and infrastructure crises. This is a cruel reality. Your rent is rising not because your apartment got better, but because the world outside your window got more expensive and more dangerous. We must now explore the final two critical markets on our list, those that represent the immediate financial consequences of the three forces we have identified. We will then transition into the final, inescapable warning about the approaching deadline. We turn our attention back to the Mountain West, to a city that embodied the pandemic-era migration frenzy, number 6, Boise, Idaho. We mentioned Boise earlier, but its current reality warrants a deeper look into the nature of its crisis. The sheer speed of the population shift, often people moving from $1.5 million California homes into the Boise economy, created an immediate, unbridgeable wage disparity. The 30% rental spike here is not solely an economic event, it is a sociological one. The local labor force, the police officers, librarians, teachers, and firefighters are all facing the same non-negotiable rent hikes as the incoming remote tech workers. The structural betrayal here is that the city's rapid economic expansion was not accompanied by any corresponding protection for the foundational workforce. The key data point is the long-term employment flight. As rents soar past $2,000 for a modest apartment, critical service employees are forced to commute over an hour from increasingly distant towns, or leave the state entirely. This creates a feedback loop. The lack of local labor drives up the cost of services, plumbers, electricians, restaurant staff, which in turn feeds inflation, which then justifies the next round of rent hikes. Boise is caught in a self-destructive spiral where its success is actively making it unlivable for the very people who maintain its quality of life. The 30% shock is simply the market's final price tag for a life near the mountains, and that price is set to filter out 90% of the long-term community. Moving to our final detailed deep dive, we examine a city that proves the rental crisis is not just a coastal or Sun Belt phenomenon, but an existential threat to the American heartland. Number 5, Knoxville, Tennessee. Knoxville's crisis, while less flashy than Brooklyn's, is arguably more insidious because it targets a population that had assumed financial safety. The local myth was stable growth anchored by academia and healthcare. The betrayal is the suddenness of the external wealth. As Nashville became impossibly expensive, investor capital and migrating families, seeking the next value market, pivoted hard to Knoxville. The key data point is the unprecedented velocity of single-family home acquisition by corporations over the last 18 months. These investors saw the large inventory of older, well-maintained, and previously owner-occupied homes as perfect targets for conversion into high-yield rentals. This aggressive conversion removed crucial entry-level buying inventory and simultaneously saturated the rental market with high-priced corporate units. The local, mom-and-pop landlords, who had been charging reasonable rates, were immediately emboldened by the new, higher ceiling set by the corporate players. The 30% spike here will be a domino effect, starting with the corporate units and immediately cascading down to the entire market. For the average Knoxville family, this spike is a shock that their stagnant local wages cannot possibly absorb. It is the final dismantling of the Southern affordability dream, proving that no market is safe from the ruthless efficiency of investment capital when it smells an opportunity for exponential profit. The inescapable deadline, by Christmas. We have laid bare the structural forces and the 10 cities facing the most severe and immediate threat of a 30% rental spike. But the central, non-negotiable factor in this forecast is the deadline, by Christmas. This is not a dramatic flourish, it is a function of predictable market cycles and landlord strategy. First, the lease renewal tsunami. The peak period for lease renewals in the most competitive U.S. markets is concentrated in the late summer and early fall. Landlords know that tenants who must renew between September and November have the least leverage. Moving during the holiday season, late November and December, is prohibitively expensive, stressful, and logistically difficult, especially for families with children in school. Landlords time their most aggressive rent hike demands, the 25% and 30% jumps, precisely for this window, knowing the tenant's resistance is at its lowest point due to the approaching holidays. The fear of moving during December and January is a powerful psychological tool used to force acceptance of the spike. Second, the interest rate freeze and the January exodus. Landlords are watching the Federal Reserve just as closely as buyers. They know that if interest rates show any sign of dropping or stabilizing early in the new year, January-February, it could signal a thaw in the buying market, potentially pulling some of the highest quality renters out of the rental pool. To maximize profits before this potential exodus begins, landlords must extract the highest possible rent for the new 12-month lease cycle now. The aggressive 30% spike, secured by Christmas, locks the tenant into an unchangeable high-price commitment before any potential market shift can occur. It is a last-minute insurance policy against a possible 2026 economic thaw. Third, the corporate budget cycle. Large institutional landlords operate on strict quarterly and annual profit targets. The final quarter of the year, Q4, is often used to lock in maximum annualized revenue figures to satisfy shareholders and secure bonuses. The high, non-negotiable rent hikes demanded between October and December are crucial for showing exponential growth and high yield to investors as the calendar year closes. The 30% spike is, therefore, a scheduled financial event, a demand driven by Wall Street, not local operating costs. The window for tenants to act, to negotiate, to relocate, or to make the painful decision to downsize is closing rapidly. The pressure is building, and the market is about to execute a swift, brutal correction that will be felt not on the housing price index, but directly in your bank account. This next rental shock is the final, brutal lesson of America's housing crisis. The system has been fundamentally rewired to extract maximum profit from those who cannot afford to buy. The dream is deferred, and the price of that deferral is a crushing, non-negotiable spike. The cold, hard truth is this: the affordability crisis in America is not a headline for 2026, it is the reality of this holiday season. The 30% rental spike is coming, driven by the algorithms, the frozen lending market, and the unyielding forces of concentrated capital. The time for waiting for a soft landing has passed. Action is now mandatory. Protect your finances, reassess your location, and understand that in these 10 cities, the market is no longer seeking balance, it is executing a mass financial purge. The rental shock is here, and only vigilance will save your budget.